My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Rugrats Go Wild was an ambitious crossover long before ambitious crossovers were the popular thing to do. Go Wild combined the Rugrats, which already had 2 theatrical films under its belt, and the Wild Thornberrys, which had just released a film roughly 6 months earlier. On paper, it seems like an idea that will just print money. In reality, Nickelodeon never initially planned for this idea to hit theatres, which probably explains the close proximity to the release of the Wild Thornberrys movie. Initially, Rugrats Go Wild was being produced by Klasky Csupo's television unit, but after extremely positive test screenings, Paramount wanted to shelve the film and retool it into a theatrical release, a decision they'd probably end up regretting. Hitting theatres on June 13, 2003, Go Wild saw average box office returns, not even coming close to the heights of the first 2 Rugrats films. A unique attraction for the film was the use of odorama, which employed scratch and sniff cards to allow audiences to smell odours linked with the film. In the middle of screenings, pop-ups would come on screen telling you to scratch and sniff the correlating section of the card. It seemed like a helpful promotional tool that was being handed out via Blockbuster and Burger King, but ultimately they were criticised for just smelling like cardboard. The other major promotional tool for Rugrats Go Wild was a video game adaptation. Released a couple of weeks before the film on May 28, this would mark the first Nickelodeon game since November of the previous year. Go Wild came to both the GBA and PC and was a significant milestone for both franchises represented here. For Rugrats, this would be the last time the original series released a game on consoles, while the Thornberrys would be bowing out for good. If you look this game up online, you'll find basically every mention of it attributing Magellan Interactive as the developer. This is just completely false, and I actually have no idea how this mistake has occurred. As you can clearly see when you play the game, the developer in charge was Imagine Engine. They don't seem to have any relationship with Magellan, so it's really confusing how they've been plastered all over this as the developer. Rugrats Go Wild marked Imagine Engine's first foray into Nickelodeon, but it wouldn't be their last. They found themselves as a regular PC collaborator, creating SpongeBob Typing, Nicktoons Basketball, and Fairly OddParents Shadow Showdown. Nickelodeon's games based on their theatrical movies have been extremely disappointing so far. Will this Rugrats and Wild Thornberrys super team be able to turn things around? Rugrats Go Wild is broken into 2 different sections. The first you'll experience is the top-down overworld. Sort of following the film's narrative, the Rugrats babies wash up on this island, which serves as the backdrop for your time with the game. Immediately you'll be controlling Tommy, sort of aimlessly wandering around, picking up pink and blue goo. The pink goo is actually ammo for an attack you can use in some levels, while the blue stuff is your health. Bizarrely, both of these constantly respawn, so you can infinitely farm the stuff. The only real action you can perform while in the top-down mode is walking around. Thankfully, you can also run by pressing B, a welcome addition that makes exploring relatively painless. Quickly you realise the overworld exists purely to make you do fetch quests. Tommy will constantly be asked to find some sort of item, and after retrieving it you'll jump into actual gameplay. There's 2 types of gameplay here. In the first level you'll get a taste of the side-scrolling action segments, for lack of a better term. I don't even know what the right term would be to describe this. Essentially, you're platforming on just a single screen with your objective centered on killing a specific number of enemies to succeed. Your initial experience with this is fighting off monkeys while jumping around jungle-themed platforms. Just like in the overworld, the ammo and health pickups infinitely respawn, so you shouldn't have too much trouble. Dispatching all of the monkeys brings on an epic boss showdown with a gorilla. Thanks to the infinitely respawning health and ammo pickups, you're free to just stand right in front of the boss and pelt him with goop until he dies. The next time you experience this level, it's the exact same thing, only you're fighting alligators instead of monkeys. And it isn't just the gameplay that's the same, the environment used is practically identical. Not even bothering to give the second level a new coat of paint is pretty telling in regards to Go Wild's quality. Eventually they do change it up a decent amount for your third outing. You're randomly given control of Eliza here and you head underwater. Naturally, this changes the dynamics as you're no longer platforming, instead you're driving a submarine type vehicle. The goal here is the same though, kill sharks and eels until the game says it's time for a boss battle. The final time we see this type of gameplay is actually the finale of this whole experience. We have to save Nigel, who's being attacked by crabs. Again, we're tasked with killing a certain number of enemies, but to Imagine Engine's credit, there's an extra wrinkle here. The crabs are tossing around sand, which will chip away at Nigel's health bar. If he hits 0, it's game over. Needless to say, this kind of platforming/combat gameplay is never anything close to good. It's ridiculously basic, pathetically easy, and always overstays its welcome. It's not the worst thing I've ever played though, to be perfectly honest. I would probably be a little bit more positive about this if the first and second levels weren't practically identical. The last 2 levels offer enough alterations to the formula to keep you engaged, so if they had found a twist for the alligator level, that would have been nice. Wouldn't have drastically altered my opinion, but it's better than just a copy-paste job. It's also really strange that the game places such a strong emphasis on attacking animals. Seeing Eliza wail on marine animals in her level is just a jarring sight to see. Where this type of gameplay really stinks is in the movement controls. Somehow it feels both sluggish and stiff while also being slippery. The majority of the time it feels like you're lugging around a Mack truck, but then at incredibly random moments it'll become all loose and you'll see your character flung across the screen to their death. It's a contradiction on paper, but Rugrats Go Wild manages to check both boxes at each end of the spectrum when it comes to awful platforming controls. The second style of gameplay actually had a whole lot of potential to be really fun, but ends up being the less enjoyable of the styles on show. It combines racing, action, and chase segments into one package. For example, the very first time you experience this, Tommy is tasked with catching a cub for some reason. Still not really sure why he was doing this, because the game's excuse for it is almost non-existent. This means you start off racing around a little track trying to catch up to the cub. Once you stop it, you quickly find that an angry mother is breathing down your neck, flipping the level into a chase segment where you have to outlast your pursuer for a set amount of time. Look, it's not groundbreaking or anything, but at a glance this seemed like a solid idea. These segments would have been great fun if the driving controls weren't arguably the worst of any video game ever made. To drive any of the vehicles you get control of in Go Wild, you need to hold down the D-pad the entire time. If you take your finger off and then try to resume control, the vehicle has a panic attack and all of a sudden you've done a 360 pop shove it. You'll hold down the directional button for which way you want to go, and then you'll have to slide your finger across to another button depending on which way you want to turn. It's the most bizarre racing controls I've ever experienced. It feels horrendous to play. My thumbs actually kind of hurt by the end of it all from constantly mashing down the D-pad. Imagine Engine do a good job of spicing up the different levels using this style of gameplay, even if it's mostly a new coat of paint, but frustratingly the fundamentals are too poor to enjoy it. These slight tweaks usually brought some more bizarre speed bumps too though. In Eliza's tubing level, your goal is to collect a number of items. However, because it takes the design idea from the first level where you're constantly looping around a small track, they have to repeatedly respawn the items. It just creates a really weird feel about the gameplay. It all feels so cheap. The Convy level is pretty much the same thing too, although this time you have to contend with a bunch of other cars randomly racing around that can steal the items out from under you. There was potential with the basic idea here, but Imagine Engine really missed the mark after they fleshed the idea out. Rugrats Go Wild is a constant loop. You go do a fetch quest on the island, completing this takes you to a level, you participate in one of 2 types of gameplay, then you rinse and repeat. The game doesn't do a great job of drawing you in with a retelling of the film either. It feels like the game very quickly abandons the idea of any narrative drive whatsoever, instead just having the player randomly stumble from NPC to NPC to do seemingly unrelated levels. It all just ends with you throwing goop at some crabs in what is essentially the exact same level as the one you kickstarted the game with. There's no sense of purpose to anything. Emphasizing this is the fact that later in the game you can end up doing levels out of order apparently. I stumbled upon Debbie at the Convy, which launched me into the Convy level. Beating this gave me nothing, so I just sort of awkwardly moved on. Then later on I discovered Nigel, who wanted me to bring him a camera. Bit of a weird request to give to a baby, but sure. Where can I find a camera, Nigel? To the absolute thrill of me, he instructed that I should go back and see Debbie, where I was forced to do that level again. The icing on the cake of Rugrats Go Wild is just how basic it feels in every single aspect. It's also bare bones that it comes across as a project that could have easily been home on the Game Boy Color. There's just so many little things, like the fact that dying sees you respawn with the minimum health possible. You could immediately chalk this down to being the game's way of punishing the player for dying, but that's contradicted by the fact that the game also respawns a bunch of health pickups right next to you. And then you also just have the fact that health pickups infinitely respawn in the overworld too. It makes no sense and it's so unnecessary. Visually, the game is unsurprisingly lackluster. The in-game visuals are nothing notable, and you get 2 tiny little cutscene type things at the beginning and end of the game depicting moments from the film. Rugrats Go Wild underwhelms on pretty much every level. What can I say? Rugrats Go Wild is yet another uninspired handheld cash-in for a Nickelodeon theatrical film. It's easily one of the worst games I have ever played, and I genuinely didn't enjoy a single second of it. There are 1 or 2 tiny idea nuggets here that could have been expanded on to provide a little bit of enjoyment, but outside of that, it's incredibly dire. In general, Nickelodeon's recent offerings have been brutal. It feels like Enter the Cleft is the only game with more decent qualities than awful ones in the past couple of months. Hopefully that's all about to turn around. Next week we'll be looking at Rocket Power's Zero Gravity Zone. The Rocket Power handheld games have been pretty solid, so we might have something to look forward to there. And then beyond that, we've got Jimmy Neutron Jet Fusion, the debut of TAC, and then the holy grail of Nickelodeon games, Battle for Bikini Bottom. At a glance, this really feels like where Nickelodeon starts to get on a roll. To make sure you catch all those reviews, hit the subscribe button.